This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book Anti-Diet. Join me here every week as I talk with fellow anti-diet advocates about their journeys toward peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 248 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fat liberation activist Angelina Moles about how the COVID-19 pandemic perpetuates oppression and trauma, her shift from body positivity to fat liberation, why subtle forms of weight stigma can be more harmful than overt ones sometimes, the trauma of medical fatphobia, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment, but first I'll answer this week's listener question. It's from a listener named Julia who writes, "Hi, Christy. First of all, I want to say a huge thank you for showing up the way you have and are as a dietitian, social justice warrior, podcaster, and just such a kick-ass woman. Your podcast has been the catalyst for my own recovery and the fuel that keeps me going when things get hard. I'm currently at home living with my family due to COVID. Home is a place of regression. My mom and dad both have disordered relationships with food, and as someone trying to recover, it is hard AF. Anyways, I've been able to open my mom's mind to intuitive eating and health at every size, but her mind is still totally wrapped in healthism and the moralization of food and fitness. I've really tried to explain that health is not a moral obligation, specifically after my mom recently said, "Wow, your uncle just told me he has gained X pounds during quarantine. How bad?" I questioned her use of quote-unquote bad, and she got very defensive. She says she believes that the quote-unquote extreme view that health is not a moral obligation might be helpful in recovery, but ultimately we each still have some responsibility to be healthy and fit, especially if we want universal health care. She implied that those who do not, quote-unquote, take care of themselves create a reason not to have universal health care and end up adding more costs and strain on the system. I felt very ill-equipped in how to respond, so I didn't, but I think her perspective is fatphobic and harmful, so I want to address it with her. I'm wondering if you would offer your thoughts and advice for how to respond to my mom and to the idea that health is a moral obligation for the sake and effectiveness of universal health care. Thank you, Christy. So thanks, Julia, for that great question. And before I answer, just my standard disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only, aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice, and don't constitute a dietitian-patient relationship. So this is a question I think a lot of people share when they're first learning about health at every size, HAES for short, and they're experiencing cognitive dissonance with everything they've been conditioned to believe about weight and health in diet culture. So we'll talk about those assumptions a little more in a minute, but first I want to just unpack the idea that health is not a moral obligation, because I think it's nuanced, and this idea can definitely rub some people the wrong way at first. And actually, my thinking on this has evolved through conversations with colleagues and readers and listeners over the years, because I used to just use that phrase, health is not a moral obligation, without clearly specifying the context in which that's true. And I've realized it's actually important to include that context to avoid any confusion and pushback. So when I say that health is not a moral obligation, what I mean is that you are not morally obligated to pursue quote unquote health And the term health can have different meanings, so we'll talk more about that in a minute too, but no individual is morally obligated to pursue our culture's idea of what health is supposed to look like, which in diet culture means thinness and a particular body shape and particular way of eating that's really out of reach for the vast majority of people. So diet culture's idea of health is oppressive. And it sounds like your mom is buying into that idea when she says, she's using this coded language of people who don't take care of themselves, right, to mean people who are larger-bodied. And that is oppressive. And the truth is that you as an individual do not have to pursue diet culture's idea of health, or any other idea of health for that matter, in order to be worthy of respect, compassion, acceptance, and love. That's what I mean when I say you are not morally obligated to pursue health. Your moral value does not depend on the size and shape of your body, or what and how you eat, or how you choose to move or not move your body, or any other health choices you might make. And speaking of choices, I would say that a lot of the time, maybe even most of the time, which we'll talk about in a minute, those things aren't actually choices. Because the size and shape of your body, what and how you eat, and how you move or don't move your body, and how you might take care of yourself in other ways are constrained by factors like your genetics and past life experience, your income level and access to food and movement, your experiences of ability and disability, your experiences of weight stigma or race-based stigma or other forms of discrimination, and so many other things that are beyond your individual control. So that's the context for the idea that health is not a moral obligation. I think it'd be more accurate actually to say pursuing health as an individual is not a moral obligation. So that's the context in which I use that phrase. And I also think that collectively, we actually do have an obligation to take care of each other and tend to the health of our communities as a matter of social justice, as long as we're not construing health in the way that diet culture sees it, because that's not aligned with justice. But instead, we're viewing health in the sense of well-being, a truly holistic sense of health, right, that includes mental, emotional, and social health in addition to physical health. That is the kind of health promotion that I think we as a society have an obligation to do, actually, right? And, at the social level, again, so that's policy, that's programs, that's institutions, and that's the collective. And that means, again, individuals are not the ones that are the focus here. Individuals are not more or less deserving based on how they match up or don't match up with an external ideal of health, but instead that a given society has a responsibility to do everything it can to care for its people, including its most marginalized people, not leaving anyone behind. And we actually see that this social responsibility exists in the research on the social determinants of health. That research really shows that nearly 3/4 of our population health outcomes are determined by social factors that we don't have any individual control over, but that we do have some societal, some systemic control over. So social factors like economic security for our people, access to food, water, shelter, clean air, safe neighborhoods, social connectedness or exclusion, experiences of discrimination or privilege, education, and access to high-quality healthcare, compassionate healthcare that is evidence-based and effective. And so all of those things are the social determinants of health, which make up, again, about 3/4 of our population health outcomes. And only about 25 to 30% of our population health outcomes are attributable to individual health behaviors. So the things that we do as individuals to take care of ourselves. And a mere 10% of those population health outcomes are attributable to eating and exercise behaviors, which is like the exact opposite of what diet culture leads us to believe, right? Diet culture leads us to believe it's like 95 to 100% is down to eating and exercise. Meanwhile, it's actually only 10%. So you can see from this research, and I'll put some links to some of this research in the show notes for this episode for people who are interested in learning more. But you can see from this that what we eat and how we move our body is so much less important than the things that aren't actually within our individual control, but that are within societal and collective control. And so in this larger sense, I would say working for the true well-being of everyone is a societal responsibility, and universal healthcare fits right into that responsibility, right? And so, by the way, does ending weight stigma and diet culture, because it's clear from the research there that weight stigma and weight cycling likely account for most, if not all, of the excess risk for certain negative health outcomes that we see in higher weight people. And I talk a lot more about that. I go into a lot of depth about that in my book, Anti-Diet, which is full of scientific references if you want to check those out. So I would recommend that as a resource on learning more about weight stigma and weight cycling. But I talk in the book about the research showing that trying to lose weight usually leads to weight cycling, and rhetoric that connects body size to health and like morality and personal responsibility generally leads to weight stigma. And both weight cycling and weight stigma are independent health risk factors, meaning that regardless of someone's actual size, their actual body weight, the more weight stigma and weight cycling they've experienced in their life, the higher their risk for adverse health outcomes is. Although, of course, in our society, the higher your weight is, right? In Western culture anyway, the higher your weight is, generally the more weight stigma and weight cycling you've been subjected to. So it's, disproportionately impacting the highest weight people and the most marginalized people, but people all across the weight spectrum are impacted by weight stigma and weight cycling. So to tie it back into this issue of universal healthcare then, I hope you can see from that discussion of the research that it really shows it's not individual people's responsibility to shrink their body in order to allow us to have universal healthcare. It's actually society's responsibility to provide healthcare to all its people as part of an overall effort to improve population well-being by addressing the social determinants of health, which again include access to healthcare, as well as ending stigma and discrimination. So by stigmatizing people and telling them it's their individual responsibility to lose weight or we won't be able to have universal health care, that's actually contributing to these social determinants of health that negatively impact people's well-being. That's actually contributing to the weight stigma and oftentimes the weight cycling too, right? The impetus to diet, the desire to lose weight to escape that stigma that people in larger bodies disproportionately face. And if we took away that weight stigma and weight cycling, I think we would see vastly improved health across the weight spectrum, especially for people in the very largest bodies. So I hope that helps answer your question and gives you some food for thought for talking to your mom about this. And anyone else who wants to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me any question you want and have me answer it much more quickly, you can come check out my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals, where I do a monthly Q&A podcast just for course participants that helps you work through the nuances of intuitive eating and all your individual questions and concerns so that you can reconnect with the innate wisdom about food and movement that we're all born with. You'll also get hours of teachings about intuitive eating, plus a private community forum just for course participants, so that you can have daily support from me and my team, as well as hundreds of other great people who are on the anti-diet path alongside you. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is available now wherever books are sold. It's a great companion to this podcast and my other work because it goes into depth about diet culture and the ways that it harms us, with tons of scientific references, as I mentioned, and other resources to help you make the anti-diet case to the people in your life and to yourself. I've been a journalist for more than 17 years now, and actually about 10 of them were spent researching and working on this book in some form or another, including talking through some of the ideas in interviews right here on the podcast. So if you want to learn how to recognize and reject diet culture and cultivate an approach to food and movement that's truly health promoting and exhaustively researched, you can grab a copy of Anti-Diet today. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it. That's christyharrison.com/book. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Angelina Moles, which was recorded before this most recent uprising for racial justice. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
So my relationship with food growing up, like most of the memories I feel like I have are good memories, moments of like a lot of family coming together. We always kind of got everybody together during larger holidays. And that would mean like 30 plus people in my family getting together over a lot of food at like a really big table. And I remember growing up and having a lot of food around. And in my culture, like food and community is so important. So there's always food at every like event or family gathering, no matter what. It was like everything was always centered around a big lunch or a big dinner of something. And I can feel that joy, and I still like feel that when I'm around family now, but I also remember all the moments of like control and scarcity that came up oftentimes growing up. I've been fat since I was a baby, and both of my parents are fat, and I have a lot of relatives who are fat as well. And it was nice to have that representation of fat bodies, but oftentimes it was a very negative representation because of the centering of food as not to be pleasurable, as needing to be controlled, or like, the controlling that would happen to the kids in my family too, including myself, especially at like early ages, being told like, I shouldn't be eating these things, or like there's a specific way to eat, or whatever it might have looked like. And having that kind of build up since a kid, it's obviously carried on with me now. But as a child, I feel like it moved very quickly from like, this is fun, and like we have food, and people seem to laugh and have fun when we have food. And then it moved into like, well, maybe only certain people get to laugh and have fun when we're around food. Like, very interesting switch that happened, was very noticeable around certain areas of my family. But I feel like the family members who were really stuck and really close to our culture still really tried to keep pleasure as a center of food and keep food as something exciting and something to play with.
So it's kind of more assimilation, and like people who are maybe further away from your culture that were doing more of the policing around food and body size.
Yeah, very much so. And it was easy to see that. My mom she immigrated to this country in the 70s, and my family is centered around my mom and everything that she brings to our home. And you could see a stark difference between like our family and my cousins, who might have had like more control around eating and more diet talk happening around them that then like trickled into our home as well.
So it wasn't so much present in your immediate family on a day-to-day basis, but more with extended family.
Yeah, and it definitely began to happen in our family once my mom had like witnessed all those feelings around food and bodies and diets and sorts. And I remember at like a very young age, my mom ended up getting like a bariatric surgery because of that reflection of hate against her own body and her own self. And when that happened, I was probably like, I feel like I was probably like 8 or younger actually. And that completely changed my relationship with food, because I had to watch my mom completely change her life around food. And then that was like this trickle down effect on all of us.
Because that's such a dramatic shift, right? Like, and I've had people on the show who've either had bariatric surgery or talked about the risks of bariatric surgery and the complications. And it's really intense. People have to completely upend how they eat, and often eat in a really disordered way. One of the most recent people who shared about bariatric surgery on the show said that it was basically like an enforced eating disorder in her view, that she felt like she had to start eating in this restrictive way that was very similar to like anorexia. And that is so hard to witness as a kid, seeing a parent go through that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that person who put it as like this eating disorder that happened is very true in those moments, because it's like a full control over what you're allowed to eat, and then a control of like what your body even will take, essentially, because like it's going through so much trauma and so much change in that surgery moment that it completely changes the relationship of like how you're eating, what you can eat, and all those things. And it's forced. I don't think at any point my mom wanted to have that happen to her in terms of what she could and could not eat, but it was like her body was rejecting everything. And then I was having to like witness and console in those moments and not know like how to hold that. Like, is my mom sick? But she chose this thing. And so like maybe this sickness is good. And like now more people are giving her compliments and saying nice things to her. So maybe like these things all work together, that the more sick she gets, the better people think she deserves more compliments or whatever that looks like. So having that happen at like 7 to 8 years old really, I think, started my own reflection of like, what does it mean to exist in my fat body? And now like home is no longer the place where my fat body feels normal.
Was there any sort of overt policing of your body at home? Was it like you were encouraged to do the same things as your mom, eat in disordered ways? Obviously not with bariatric surgery, but eat in a disordered way toward the end of shrinking your body?
I definitely think so. And I think it mostly started like after going to like doctor visits and having doctors recommend certain things, certain ways of living for me around food control, around body size. And then I think with my parents being in that room with me, hearing the doctor saying those things, they took it as like a reflection of bad parenting onto them. And then when we came home, it was like, okay, now how can we like correct this type of issue? But I feel like it wasn't super obvious or explicit in a lot of ways until I was kind of older to see how it was more explicit than maybe I was feeling it was. And it really happened in moments of like, I would see how much my mom had on her plate and how much like everybody else had on their plates. And I was thinking like, should my plate look like my mom's? And then when I ended up starting to have disordered eating, there was these moments of like people would see what I was eating in my house and like my dad would say, oh, that's a good choice, not understanding like that was like my one only meal of the day or like whatever that might have looked like. So there was like this very interesting complimenting happening with maybe not even knowing as a result of me seeing like all of those interactions happening with my mom and then wanting them to also happen to me. And also, of course, like, you know, being in school, like kids are terrible. We're just like all growing up and all being mean to each other in so many weird ways. So I was like getting bullied at school every day and then like coming home to like a treat that my dad would have brought home after work or like my mom cooked or like my ava cooked, which is grandma. And I was like, okay, so like it's fine because like here's this comfort, but then also it wouldn't always work out because my mom wouldn't partake in the treat, or like if she partook in the treat, bad things would happen to her body or whatever it might have happened. Her body would reject it. So it was like I couldn't easily flip back and forth between all those moods and like all those places of my day.
Yeah, that's so confusing as a kid too, because you're looking to the adults in your life for a model of how to be. And I can see that it would probably be so confusing to have like your mom eating a certain way and getting compliments for her body and compliments for how she's eating. And then to see other people eating a different way or showing, you know, modeling a different form of like pleasure and relationship with food that wasn't about that sort of restriction. But then to see that your mom can't partake, or if she does, it leads to really bad consequences. Oh, how confusing is that, you know? Because at a young age, you don't really understand, okay, this is a surgery. She has like these specific needs because her stomach was amputated, basically, and her body is going to react differently. You probably just saw it as like, well, if I want to be like mom and I want to be getting compliments, then I need to do this.
yeah, it was such a hard thing to hold to because then also at that same time of like the surgery that I really didn't understand what was happening, but seeing all the like aftermath, my sister was also working in a local gym. And I guess maybe as a result of that, had also gone through a huge change in body size and shape. So these two like very matriarchal figures in my life, because my sister was and is 12 years older than me. So like having these two matriarchal figures in my life changing so entirely in terms of their body, no longer kind of looking like me, and then being treated differently in front of me was also a way that like I can't exactly understand how to hold, like piecing all of those things together was like such a complicated puzzle. And I don't think like as a kid, I had any way to totally understand those things until like now as an adult, I'm like, yeah, that was a really interesting moment. Or like, oh, that maybe explains these things. And so being so lost and not really having anybody who could explain what was happening with my mom, because this was like the early 2000s. So bariatric surgery was like pretty new in terms of like how popular it was getting. I only knew that there was like this huge risk of like somebody losing their life and like potentially my mom being that person undergoing this surgery. And I didn't understand like why it was like an opting in choice, because I don't think it was ever framed to me as my mom like opt into this surgery. I think it was very framed to me as like, this is what you need to do. This is what you have to do to be a better mom, a better person, whatever that better is.
Wow. So it was probably sold to her under that guise of like, it's killing you. Like your body size is killing you and you have to do this in order to like be there for your kids or whatever the fear mongering tactics are.
Yeah, the capital O rhetoric, using that all of the time against her. And I remember like stories that she still tells now is that like when she carried me, she was the biggest she had ever been. And like afterwards, she just couldn't stop being big and getting bigger. And it was like this monstrosity that I was also attached to, which is very weird to have your mom be like, because of you, like, look at me. And she never specifically stated it like that, but I definitely saw this like very storybook character of this like person who just keeps growing and growing because of like me. And I'm like standing by her like, oh God, like what have I done? And not realizing like those implications on me. And so then to like piece that together as I got older of like, okay, so my mom has me, she gains a lot of weight, she stays as herself, whatever it is. She continues to be a person of size. And then she gets like her dream opportunity to not be that anymore because of the O rhetoric that's been served to her. And then I'm still like the result though. Like I'm still the aftermath of it because I've just been fat. I've continued to be fat as my life has continued.
Oh God, that must have been so painful and confusing.
Yeah.
So how did your relationship with food unfold from there then? You said it sounds like it started to become pretty disordered and you started to do things to try to shrink yourself fairly early on.
Yeah. I think I spent a lot of my early life in my grandma's house because my mom worked the day shift at like a factory farm place and my dad owned his own business. So when I was with my Ava, food was fun. Food was safe. Food was cool. It was like there was always food. And my Ava was very strong willed about being like, you need to take this food home and you need to have food in your mouth like as you're here the whole day, right? Like if you're in a bad mood, here's a plate. Whatever it might be, here's a plate. But then obviously, like once my mom had the surgery and then I was staying home more because she was home more, I think I started to notice different eating ways and food became less fun because after every meal, my mom had a bad reaction to it. And so it was like every time we ate, I was then forced to hear the aftermath of like what her surgery had done to her. And I think that's when my eating kind of became more disordered. And really, it was like at its worst in middle school, which I think is just like the time where everything is the worst, period. Like middle school should maybe be canceled. I don't know.
Yes. Oh, I would be on board with that. Middle school was awful for me too. And
Yeah.
like everyone I know, no one escapes unscathed from middle school.
Yeah. I've never heard anyone say like, you know what, seventh grade, best time of my life.
No.
You know?
Oh, never.
So I think I had some friends at that time who were also dabbling in disordered eating and would like tag me along with them to like be, I guess, a motivator. I'm not actually sure what my like body was doing in that space because I wasn't participating. I was just there witnessing. And after that, I had gotten tips and pointers from them about like how to have a disordered relationship with food. And I started to go home and research more things. And like at the time, this is like MySpace is like at its height. And so I was like a part of a very horrible grouping on MySpace where I created a fake profile and like was following a lot of disordered eating pages and like tracking my weight on my MySpace page and like following people who were doing the same things. And at that point in seventh and eighth grade, I was definitely at my worst when it came to my disordered eating behavior and dabbling in like very dangerous things and really didn't have anyone who was checking on me with my eating at all because my mom after the surgery really changed. She has depression and ever since I can remember she's had bipolar depression. And so often when I was home with her, we weren't like in the same spaces together. There wasn't really any like monitoring, I guess. So I had free roam to only like choose to eat very small things during the day. And I had free time to just be on MySpace and continue to fill my feed with pictures encouraging disordered eating and so forth. And when my dad would come home from work, there, wasn't really much questioning about food or anything of that sort. We'd sit down to eat and I would do the very typical things that you do when you have an eating disorder when it comes to like pretending like you're eating, but you're not. And I think up until maybe my sophomore year of high school, it was just really bad. I also had a moment where I went to the doctor and I think I was 15 at the time when he prescribed me diet pills and was like very highly encouraging these diet pills. And so I started to take them because like I still had a relationship where I trust my doctor at that time. And it like completely changed everything. I felt like I was just like at a like EDM dance festival all day. And like, I remember not eating hardly anything, but working out like times a day, like doing all these wild things. So I think really maybe actually the sophomore year thing isn't correct. I think maybe it wasn't until like I started dabbling into the world of body positivity in like my first year of college that my eating behaviors kind of shifted into maybe like a more healing approach.
Wow. And to have a doctor prescribe diet pills to you at 15 is outrageous. Who does that? I mean, I know so many doctors do, and it's really unfortunate. And it's just so unethical.
Yeah, so unethical, especially because then after 30 days, I came back and, I had the results that he liked, which was not being as big as I was before. And then I was like, I don't want to take these anymore because they make me feel just like crazed. And he was like, okay, that's totally fine. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to write this prescription for you and put it in your file. And if you ever change your mind, just know that these pills have worked for you and they will continue to work and they're ready for you when you're ready. That moment is so vivid. Like I can see his writing on the prescription pad. I just recall that moment so easily. And I also recall the moment of my mom asking me why I didn't keep doing it. And like, that is just like, it's so like ingrained in my entire body of that feeling of that, like, just like a collapsing of sorts. Like I didn't exactly know, like, okay, so that was a good thing, even though it made me feel so horrible because here's this doctor who's upset. And now here's my mom who's like why aren't you going to take them? And if you're not going to take them, at least you could get them for me.
That's so sad because it really does like disconnect you from your intuition. It sounds like you had a really strong intuition that like, this is not okay. This is not making me feel good. I need to stop, which is amazing. But then to have people you trust and like an authority figure in this doctor being like, well, no, you really should do this. And like, it's here when you're ready, as though there was something wrong with you for not wanting to take them because they made you feel so bad. Like, what?
Yeah. And like, a total shutdown, like you just said, of the intuition. Like, obviously, I had this moment where I was arguing for what I wanted, and then seeing that people were like, but that's not actually what you want.
Yeah, that's got to just make you feel so disconnected. I've had moments like that too. I sort of can like feel that feeling you're talking about of just like the sinking sort of like, oh shit, this thing that I thought I was doing the right thing. And then to be told that I'm so wrong is just comes out of nowhere.
Yeah. And I think that people, I mean, often like within the fat liberation community, we're talking about like force. And I think coercion is such a huge part of food, and like coercion from like anybody in like the smallest microaggression sense of the moment of being like, but is that really what you want? Or like, I'm just going to put this prescription in your file. Those moments are all these people who either have power by like a title like a doctor, or power that like you're my mom and you're encouraging this thing. That moment is so just like power stripping. It doesn't allow you to actually think about what you want, and you kind of go back into all those feelings you were having about why you even invested in disordered eating or why you have a bad body image. You go back into all those feelings once again after you just like did all this work to come out of it to say, no, that's not what I want.
Right. And yeah, it's so like insidious because it's not this overt form of weight stigma that like some people might think of when they think of weight stigma. You know, I always think about the fact that when I have debated with people who are on the weight stigmatizing side, basically the weight management side of things, and are like, no, we need to manage people's weight for their health and all this stuff. They will say that like they are anti-weight stigma and they don't want to, you know, they recognize the health problems with weight stigma and they don't want to stigmatize people. They're just doing it in like a kinder, gentler way. And like not understanding that it's never as overt as it's made out to be. So similar in so many ways to other forms of oppression, right? Where it's like racism is painted as the KKK and that's the only way that it can look. When in reality, it looks so many different subtle ways that have such an emotional impact, but that are not overt in that same way. And similarly with weight stigma, I think there's overt fat shaming, which most people, other than some heinous trolls, like would agree is not okay. But then there's like all these subtle ways that are just equally stigmatizing and equally harmful to the person receiving it, equally emotionally damaging, but that are not as visible. And the people who are doing it actually think that they're somehow being helpful or kind.
Yeah, it's that moment, like this huge, like cognitive dissonance almost of this moment where it's like, yeah, I'm being more gentle with it, but like you're still suggesting this like complete change, or that one thing is bad and the other one is good, this dichotomy of sorts. And all of these moments, like the small moments, are really what piles up more and more because they happen so much more frequently. Like it's very rare that maybe I'm like walking down the sidewalk and like a random person yells something very overtly fatphobic at me. I mean, it happens very often, but not as often as the smaller moments of, you know, looking at my plate while I'm eating, or looking at my cart while I'm shopping, or just like the too long stare, whatever it might be. Like those moments, I don't need you to say anything verbally. I can feel the things that you're maybe thinking, or like I can at least feel what I've been told that people are thinking of me. So it actually doesn't even matter what people are thinking when they look at me. I automatically go into what I have been trained to believe people would be thinking about me, or people would be saying about me. And that is like what you're saying about that insidious piece of it. It's just like, you know, those moments are really what like resonate with me more so than the very like out loud explicit moments, because they happen way more frequently than the out loud explicit moments.
And that's such a good point too, that the sort of subtle moments just resonate with the past experiences you've had and get filtered through that lens so that it doesn't really matter what someone's intentions are in the moment. If they're saying something that is aligned with what you've experienced in the past as fat phobia, like it's going to feel the same. It's going to just kind of push that button and like activate that script that is already there to be activated, even if the moment itself is like the person doesn't think of it as a big deal or something.
Right. Yeah. It's usually that moment where I think often I get myself in trouble too in those moments where we don't exactly think about like what the intent is, or like rather what the impact will be. Like I always talk to my students like intent versus impact. You can never control the impact on your audience, but you always have to be thinking about like, how might this be construed, and like to listen to that moment. I think this is like really prevalent on social media right now when people are saying like, when you look at my body in a swimsuit and you call me brave, like that's really packed with a lot behind it, because why is this an act of bravery? I understand, because fat people are told not to exist in these spaces or not to exist out loud. But by saying it's brave and like, oh, I'm so like wildly jealous of the confidence you have, you're also reinscribing the truth of like, I'm not supposed to be doing these things, or like, you couldn't do this if you looked like me. Those kind of stigmas are also placed there too.
Right, totally. It's like, oh, you're brave for doing this. I could never, I would never, sort of implying there's something wrong with you for doing it. And it is so subtle. It's like that people don't even recognize the impact that they're having, and the intent behind it isn't malicious, but it's like, you know, for someone who has experienced so much stigma, that's going to land in a really hurtful way.
Right.
Oh, so that sounds really, really tough. It sounds like you had so much pressure on you to lose weight and sort of to like ignore your own body's wisdom and your own intuition about what was or wasn't working for you. How did it go from there? Like you said, in college, you started to discover body positivity, but what made you ready for that, I guess? What made you ready to sort of resonate with body positivity by that point?
I think what happened was I was spending more time outside of the house. I was also kind of like breaking free of my like K through 12 experience. I come from a very small town, so everybody that I went to kindergarten with, I graduated high school with. Like we all stayed the same. So anything that happened in like the third grade when I'm like, you know, in PE, whatever, lingered until I was graduating my senior year. And so like kind of letting go of all that felt really great, even though I was still really close to my hometown. I lived there. I was just going to college in a town over. It still felt like I was breaking free of like that identity that had followed me for so long. And when I went to college, I mean, granted, like the first 2 years, I still feel like I was very high school mentality of like thinking about all the things about looks and perceptions. But I had a friend group that I had made, and I was more involved with things. And I started an Instagram account. And that was like right when Instagram was starting to be, I guess, more popular. And at first, it was a very horrible Instagram page of me like tracking progress with my body and like gym selfies and all the things that I absolutely block now in life on Instagram.
Same.
And yeah, I've learned now. Then I just like stumbled upon like a couple of, I would say like they weren't really like fat positive pages. They were definitely situated in like body positivity of like pretty smaller fat spectrum people. But it was like the first time that I had saw people who even like relatively looked like me online and were like having fun and like wearing bathing suits and going to the beach and like wearing really awesome clothes. And I was like, huh, this is so interesting. And like, I felt like warm inside almost like, like this is what I need. And so then I started kind of posting more outfit inspiration or like, just like, you know, body positive kind of affirmations. And I think it was like my senior year in college, I like wrote an article for our newspaper where I posed in my underwear next to my very thin friend on the cover of this newspaper. And I wrote about like the body is not an apology kind of, mentality. Obviously that's some of Renee Taylor's work, but at that time it was more just like I was talking through like body positivity, why you shouldn't apologize for existing. And it got like positive feedback, which was such a shock because I was like really waiting for all these like negative things to happen. And then I realized like, this is like maybe what I need to be focusing on my own self. Like instead of maybe waiting for this moment for like trolls to come out, like maybe I could just live in the glory of like posting my body on a newspaper. I think I kind of let go of a lot of the food controlling that was happening. I was able to like sit at meals with friends and kind of have that community, like that culture that I grew up in of sitting around meals and having fun and having pleasure. And it was very like small moments of like success with feeling better around food. I think that right now in my life, I'm obviously feeling the best around my ability to decide what I want to eat, when I want to eat it, and how I want to eat it. It's a little hard during COVID-19 to say those things, but I think that it's not until now where I'm 26 feeling like my relationship with food has really healed a lot. And of course, I have moments where it doesn't feel that way because I'm a human being and because I'm still susceptible to everything I see online or hear from friends or whatever it might be. But I mean, it's taken a long time. And I think that's like really important to note because I often feel like when folks will talk about like healing their relationship with food, it seems like overnight. And then I tend to judge myself about how long it took. The reality is that like, yeah, it's so hard to just like sit down and eat food sometimes because of all the things around us. And now that like I'm going to the grocery store and like getting to buy what I want to buy, I think that was like the biggest moment of change for me with my relationship with food.
Do you think that came as an offshoot of the work you were doing in body positivity? Because I know you ended up getting a master's in like fat liberation, right? Basically like critical fat studies and communication. So probably at some point for you, it shifted from that early body positivity influence to more like radical fat acceptance, fat liberation ideas. And I'm wondering kind of where in there you started to feel that shift in your relationship with food.
Yeah, 100%. I think that it really happened when I got accepted into the master's program, which was in 2015. I graduated from college and I was under the guise that I would go to this program and still study communication studies. And one of the reasons why I chose to go to specifically San Francisco State University is because they do like a performance oriented communication studies program. And I'm really into performance and theater. And I was still very much enriched into the body positivity mentality. And when I went to San Francisco State, I started reading information on fat discrimination, weight stigma at doctors' offices. And that was going to be like my first project. And then ultimately what happened is that in October of 2015, I found out that I was pregnant and I was not interested or willing to engage in that moment of my life. I also have like a lot of fears around ever like carrying a thing, a being, I don't know, something, right? Because I had earlier on in my life, I had blood clots in my lungs from birth control, which was a whole thing too. And so I wanted to go through with getting an abortion. And during that process, I was fat shamed more than I had ever experienced at doctor's office, even more so than the doctor who prescribed me weight loss pills at 15 years old. Like the things that I had heard from my caregivers was like things that I could never have imagined a human being say to another human being. And I think that was actually the moment that shifted everything. I remember those feelings so vividly. I remember like talking to my professor about like how I felt like I couldn't finish the program because of everything that had happened to me. And then like, instead what I did was I wrote like a whole paper on like healthcare and abortion services and weight stigma and weight bias. And I ended up like doing a performance on it. And I think that was the moment where I was like, this is what I want to do. What I need to do is not just about body positivity, it's more about fat liberation. It's more about understanding how like this is so much deeper than just me walking around in a bathing suit saying like I love myself. It's so much more than that. It's a systemic problem. It's an ideological issue. And we've got to like dismantle all of that because otherwise like liberation can't exist with systems that are not working for liberating. So I think that moment, I don't think if I had experienced that moment any differently, I don't know if I would have continued to enrich in fat positivity or fat liberation. But I knew in that moment that that's like what I needed to do and what I wanted to do. And I think that is the moment also where my politics online started to shift as well.
I mean, I can imagine because that level of weight stigma, that level of fat phobia at the doctor is such a stark reminder that it doesn't really matter how you feel about yourself walking around in a bathing suit or how quote unquote body positive you are. If you're in a system that is violent towards you, that is, actively stigmatizing and shaming you, then no amount of positivity and self-love and sort of liking how you look is going to really touch that.
Yeah. And I think that's like exactly how I felt. It was like I left these doctor's office appointments being already super vulnerable, super scared, and then was like, well, it's okay because like I know that my body isn't the problem, but like I couldn't convince myself of that enough over what I had just heard and what was getting spewed to me. And even in doing the research and putting together the paper on weight bias, it was like I had to be re-traumatized by reading all these articles from a medical perspective of like, we interviewed 102 doctors or incoming med students about their feelings on fat people. And it was like, oh, great. Like, love to read this, but like having that re-traumatizing of reading those studies, I think ultimately pushed me to be like, what the hell are we doing? We've got to really change and work on these things. And then that's where I started to find people like Sonia Renee Taylor. And that's where I started to find people who were speaking about things that like were centered on not only self-love, but about the conversations on bodies and fat bodies more specifically. And then also discussing what it means to have the intersection of fat and disability studies together and understanding how those two things need to work together to liberate each other. It's obvious that all of the fat liberation is essentially started from Black femmes who are creating all of this work and situating themselves in this amazing liberation too. And I think all of us have to also honor that as a part of this process, that we're all building from that.
That's so great that body positivity was a door into that for you and that you were able to get deeper and find this fat liberation work that really spoke to you and that really, resonated with what you had gone through. How did that change your own relationship to like the medical field and to your body in general?
I think that when I discovered fat liberation, it ultimately made me feel like my body wasn't a problem and that I had just been being like force fed a narrative that it was. It also made me feel a lot less lonely about the idea that maybe I was the only fat person ever experiencing these things, which like I never truly believed that, but it felt that way in so many moments of my life. And when it came to kind of interacting with healthcare providers, I felt like I was able to ask for what I wanted, or even be able to say, I don't want to engage in this like very explicit negative body talk, or like, I've always had a lot of doctors try to interest me in bariatric surgeries. And I think that through fat liberation, I've been able to say like, no, I'm not interested in that. Don't want to hear about that program. Or like, can we focus back on what I originally asked? And I kind of come with a very defensive shell on. And I'm also a very sensitive and emotional person. And so oftentimes when any fat shaming tends to happen, or even in the moment where I'm trying to neglect it or tell them that I don't want it, I end up like crying in those moments. And I think that just shows like how much trauma is being held in those spaces. But I feel like before finding fat liberation, I wouldn't have even had the moment to say, no, thank you, or like, can we stay on track? And I think those small changes of just being able to say, I don't want to get weighed today, or like, why do I need to get weighed? Does this relate to anything that we have to do today? I think those small moments are so huge for so many of us who felt like we never had the ability to say anything to our doctors because we were taught that our doctors were always right and they would never do harm.
It is huge and so hard even to just speak up to that degree to doctors because it takes so much mental fortitude and ability to challenge an authority figure, which is really hard.
Yeah.
As much as in other spaces, like outside of the doctor's office, you might be able to really articulate like fat liberation ideas and like be really strident and push back against things. It's like such a different animal when you're confronted with the doctor.
Yeah, it's like very almost like childlike with a parent reprimanding you in public. I get shaky and like I feel my hands being clammy. And it's also all those moments of trauma being built up. It's all of the narratives that I hear online and around me about doctors and medical care and weight bias, all of these things that kind of come together into one package of just being really scared and nervous. And it's not a perfect form to try to like advocate for yourself. It's such a hard thing to do because we have not been taught that advocating for ourselves is something we should be doing. So in those moments, I'm always trying to remind myself to be gentle. Like if I leave an appointment and I didn't stand up for the, weight stigma that was being pushed on me, I'm like leaving there, reminding myself that it's a lot to handle. And like, it's okay that I didn't have the perfect response. It's okay that I didn't say anything, reminding myself that I'm going to have those moments where I fall back into allowing that kind of abuse to happen because it is a scary moment and because doctors have a lot of power over lots of different things.
That is so important too that you shared that. I'm really grateful for you articulating that because it is such a challenging thing. And I find that a lot of clients that I work with or people in my audience come to me and say like, I feel so bad because I wasn't able to stand up for myself in this moment. What should I do? Almost feeling ashamed of themselves for not being able to advocate for health at every size and fat liberation and making sure that they're not weighed or not given diet advice or things like that. But it really is so hard. And like you said, with the trauma that you've experienced, having built up over the years, like that all continues to live in your body and in your mind and come out in those moments in a situation of feeling like almost silenced. I've had people say to me, and I know for myself too, in other situations where I've been traumatized, not around body size, because I have the privilege of not having that piece, but like other traumatic issues, like I will feel like strangled almost by it. The physiology of that stress can make you feel just like literally unable to speak. So to say anything, even the smallest thing, is a huge victory. And like to have those moments when you just can't do it is completely understandable and not at all, I think like you said, just being kind to yourself and gentle and compassionate and recognizing that this is really hard and you're fighting against a whole system. It's not just you and the doctor. It's like a system of oppression that you're up against in that moment.
Right. Yeah. I think that like being gentle with ourselves is a hard skill to learn, but like there's already so many systems that we're trying to battle against. And I think like being able to hold ourselves, like actually hold, like embrace whatever it is that we're feeling and being okay with like the misstep that happened. And, we don't always have to be a superhero self and do all of the defending in all the right ways. Like sometimes we're tired. And like you said, this strangling effect is so true. It's very similar. Like it's like very speech anxiety oriented in those moments. It's like, I feel like I'm standing in front of a crowd of like 5,000 people when I'm in a small room with a healthcare provider. And I would love to see a time where I don't feel like that and where people don't feel like that in those rooms. And while it does continue to feel like that now, I think it's just about knowing that like that's a lot of pressure to hold. And it's okay that we aren't always completely 100% perfect with the way that we articulate against weight stigma, weight bias, and fat shaming that happens in those very tricky moments.
I think that's such a powerful example, too, of why this is not just an individual issue. We as individuals should not be responsible for advocating for, not being oppressed. Like and having the system change. Like that's what it really is about, is having the system change so that you don't have to go to the doctor and be subject to that same re-traumatization, so that nobody has to go to the doctor and be subject to that kind of stigma. That's what we're really aiming for. And like as individuals, we can do our best to advocate for ourselves just to make it suck less. And for those of us with privilege, maybe help move the needle so that the world becomes incrementally safer for larger bodied people or people with less privilege in whatever way. But the responsibility can't just be on the individual. This is a systemic issue, and that we need help from larger forces here to make this a safer place. And we need the medical industry and doctors themselves to like get the memo and to understand that it's not okay to treat people like that.
Exactly. I think the more we remember that this is actually not about my individual self approaching the doctors. This is not about us as individuals at all in terms of like whose fault is this or whose problem is this to remedy. It is about unpacking these systems and saying like, what is going on with our medical industry? Are we actually providing care? Are we actually doing no harm, which is a part of the ethics of being a healthcare provider? And I think like looking at those systems and pointing fingers at them and saying like, what are you going to do to change is an important piece of this. And I think like having more medical practitioners, healthcare providers opt into HAES trainings, opt into conversations on what it means to provide fat liberating care or like disabled focused care, like all of these elements of care that need to be focused in on. What would that do for their patients? Like, what would that do for us as a world in terms of our own individual relationships with ourselves? And also the relationships that we have with a well-being of sorts. Like if we shifted the dialogue from being well looks this certain way, what could we gain from that? And so I always try to remind myself that like the things that happen in terms of like weight stigma, weight bias, the trauma that I have from the doctor's office, my relationship with food, it's not because I am the problem here or that like it's my job to solve all of the things. It's about understanding how all of those systems and ideologies have come packaged together to make me feel these ways. And now we've got to like break them apart. And I think you hit on it, Christy, talking about like privilege and what that might look like, or to have actual allyship versus like the performative allyship that often happens online where it's like, hey, like this is a body positive space. And then they like post a diet advertisement or something of that sort. Like to actually have like ground work in figuring out how do we take care of our marginalized people and how do we make sure that they're not being traumatized in places that they're supposed to be receiving care.
Yes. Oh, so important. That is more nuanced and difficult work than performative allyship, I think, because I try in whatever ways I can when I'm at the doctor's office, for example, to like pave the way for people who are larger than I am to say no to the scale, or to not feel shamed and oppressed by the doctor by like speaking up if the doctor says something about food or about weight that, you know, isn't necessarily directed to me, but like we're making conversation and I say I'm a dietitian and their response is fatphobic. I can try to speak up in those moments and make a small impact in whatever way I can. And it's super scary and it's really hard. And like, I have the same reactions to doctors that you were describing, where sometimes I'm just like cowering, kind of like it's like this childlike sort of response to an authority figure that, you know, I can't always kind of push through and get what I need to get out, you know? So I think it's these like, little moments of helping be an ally and do the work. And then the bigger moments too of like changing the systems and, you know, speaking up on a cultural level. That it's tough. It's tough work. It's going to take a lot.
Yeah, it's going to have to take a lot of us, you know, holding that up all together in the hopes of a big, huge shift and change. But I think it's possible.
I do too. I'm glad to hear you say that. I'm optimistic about it as well. And I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19, because all of this fat phobia and food phobia and just horrible stuff that's coming out about people's bodies and fears of weight gain and all of that, I'm curious how that's affecting you. And also, I've been loving your work on Instagram and just pushing back on some of that. So love to hear kind of your take on like how people can support that work and like stand up against this kind of stigma.
Yeah, I mean, COVID-19 has brought up all sorts of a reigniting of isms in lots of ways, from like the racism that we see now to like pushing into these sectors of like food policing even more so than it was before, and like a whole huge uproar of fat phobia. And of course that like affects me. I think oftentimes because I maybe like create some small content, people are like, you must not feel the like pressure of that. I'm like, oh no, I feel it. You know, it's hard to like go to a grocery store and see things that I never maybe thought would be scarce or whatever it might be. And now seeing them not be there. And then like I begin to police myself in that moment. And then also this like holding of the critiques about people who are stockpiling, and then also holding the fact that like if I go to the store and I'm only shopping for myself but I have like a full cart and like things are overflowing, like that should also be okay. If I'm like grabbing a bunch of snacks and whatever it might look like, I shouldn't have to feel the pressure of somebody like looking over at me like, why are you taking that? It's like, leave me and my Nutter Butters alone, please. You know, like I think the food policing is an aspect that we don't need. I think that scarcity doesn't need to mean food policing and telling people what they can and cannot purchase. Of course, there has to be like a nuance to that where like we have to be thinking about accessibility. Not everyone's even able to get out to go to a grocery store right now or to be able to even view the food that they want to purchase. And not everybody has the money to be able to do that because let's be real, the US and their stimulus checks are kind of a joke.
Yep.
Actually, they're not kind of a joke. They're a huge joke. So I also have to be like holding that at the same time, being able that like I'm still getting to have my job and have the privilege of being paid and being able to go to a grocery store right now and wait in those lines and get the food that I want to get. It's just really intense about thinking how you're interacting with other people too. Like comments about we need to like eat this in order to like make sure it doesn't go bad, or like let's try to do this, or like how many things are you eating of this a day? Those are really hard conversations to hold. And I know that they're necessary, especially for a lot of us who are living in homes with multiple people. But I think there also has to still be the moment in which we say to ourselves, like, how do we deal with a global pandemic while also making sure that we are taking care of our needs, our basic needs like food, and making sure that we're not pushing anybody or saying things that are pushing people into more disordered eating. I know for me, it's hard to not have like a schedule because I think I was saying this earlier, like it feels like it's day like 700 of April, which makes no sense, but it feels like that. So it's easy for me to like slip really easily into disordered eating if like I don't have a reminder that like I should have eaten something by now, or like, I should listen to that cue in my body. And so what I'm trying to do is like take time to really think about like, how's my body feeling? Like if I just take a minute to listen, like how hungry is my stomach? Like that's a sign that I need to go eat a lot of good food right now. And whatever good food means to you is like how you should define it. I have like some people who are like, well, what is we shouldn't just be buying a bunch of comfort food. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like comfort food means something different for everybody. And during a global pandemic, like I hope people are finding comfort in something in some way. And if that's food, I think that that's important to find joy around still eating and consuming during this time, and making sure that you're checking in on friends who have maybe a hard time with food, and checking in with yourself as well. And even asking for people to maybe check in with you. Like I live with roommates and we're doing a good job of being like, hey, like, have you had a chance to eat something today? If not, like, I just made something and you're more than welcome to eat it. It's on the counter. Those kind of things of like community care are really important in this moment. And in terms of like the really nasty fat phobia that's coming out over like people's concerns with gaining weight during a global pandemic, I just feel like that really shows how fat phobic our society is, that during this pandemic, where there is a lot at risk, and this is a very unprecedented time for many of us because we haven't lived through other pandemics. I think if you're worrying about what your body is looking like and what pair of pants you can wear or not, that shows that we're not really focusing in on what's really important here. And my body is not a problem. And if you come out of the pandemic looking like me, like congrats, you ate good food, you relaxed, you enjoyed yourself. That's awesome. We should stop that idea that like bodies are supposed to be policed all of the time. And I think when people say I have to control my body during this like really intense traumatic time, that just like shows to me that I need to maybe encourage some less policing of the self. And it's okay to like just breathe for a second. I think that this like shelter in place is also a moment that everyone needs to kind of do some reflecting on how much time we spend trying to control every inch of our bodies. And like maybe this is a good reminder for all of us to remember that our bodies need much more care in terms of what we're usually giving them. Like we need rest. We need time to just like absorb some sun. We need time to sit and eat and enjoy and laugh, even amidst this crisis. And it feels hard to even say like find joy during this time because I'm also experiencing like a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear, just like many of us are. But I can't always exist in that moment because then like I don't know what would happen if I only existed in the moment of like trauma and fear. I also have to try my best to be okay with my decisions around what I'm eating and be okay and embrace what I look like. And body neutrality is also really important. Like you don't have to sit around saying how much you love yourself, but if you could just like refrain from the negative comments that we give to ourselves, maybe that's like movement, right? Body neutrality is a great place to begin. So I'm just like, this is a time that maybe we can reflect on a moment and think like, during a global pandemic, are our body sizes really the most important thing to be worrying about?
And the fact that this culture makes them out to be that and that it's making so many people worried about that, I think really reflects the skewed priorities that our culture has. This is not what people need to be prioritizing right now. This moment is about survival. It's about doing the best you can. And like you said, trying to find some joy, trying to find some light amidst the darkness of this moment. And that's about all we can do or should be expected to do. We're just getting by.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that there are privileges amidst this conversation. And I think that we obviously have to acknowledge those. And I think that like one of the aspects of sheltering in place and like trying to avoid the spread of the pandemic is also an act of community care, which we should be considering. Like another act of community care is honoring the fact that our bodies are supposed to change. They're supposed to grow and they're supposed to be different and do different things as a part of this. And like, as a fat person who's also has some privileges in being able-bodied and having white privilege, I know that like interacting with the medical system during this crisis for me still feels very scary as a fat person. Like getting equitable care during a non-pandemic is already hard, and getting care during a pandemic, I don't even know what that looks like. But I also have some privileges where like I hear other friends of mine who are also fat and have more complicated intersections thinking that like if they interact with COVID-19 in a certain way and have to go to a medical system, like that doesn't look good because now equitable care is like even more pushed to the side because we're in such like this emergency state. So I think it's rather than worrying about a body becoming fat, I think it's about worrying about fat bodies getting equitable care.
Yes. So well said. And I think it's so tricky because right now we're in this moment where the CDC and like certain researchers and people who like to talk a big game about weight loss and stuff are saying that larger body size is a risk factor and that people who are larger bodied are more likely to get more serious cases of this, which the science really isn't there to say that yet or at all, because they're not controlling. There's very limited studies, first of all. And second of all, they're not controlling for things like socioeconomic status and race and quality of care and things that we know affect people's health outcomes and that are likely affecting the differential outcomes we're seeing in COVID-19. But also like saying that and trying to paint like larger body size as a risk factor, I think is really problematic because again, the medical system might think like, oh, we're doing this so that like we can pay more attention and be more caring with larger bodied people. But actually, it's creating more stigma. It's like piling on top of the pre-existing stigma that's there. And it's making it so that people in larger bodies, but also like people with disabilities, older people with all kinds of pre-existing conditions are being considered like they're at higher risk. So therefore, maybe they should be less likely to get interventions because they're somehow less likely to be saved. I think that is something that could potentially happen if triaging is happening and care is being rationed in certain healthcare systems. And that's really scary. And that's really not cool. That is discrimination. That is oppression. And that's not okay.
Yeah, exactly. The decisions, I couldn't even imagine what it would be like to be in the medical industry right now and have to make those decisions, but also thinking about bodies like mine having to be faced with a medical provider, having to make that decision about a body like mine or a body that's much more marginalized than mine. Like that is such a scary place. And when you have an organization like the CDC, which so many people are relying on for like up-to-date info, providing very skewed, weight-biased, fatphobic info, then it only perpetuates more on those folks who are saying like, I don't want to be fat at the end of this. Now they have like an organization that can back up a reason why they don't want to be that way. And I think that obviously furthers the push that fat liberation is trying to push and kind of getting that message out even more. And honestly, like anytime any industry uses BMI, I'm like, delete, trash, that's gone, because it's a system that doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It's arbitrary. It exists as much as like nothing. That's what it exists as. So I just feel like if we could even spread the message more about BMI being a hoax and like being not real and having no merit, then maybe people would read those messages with a broader understanding of it. But like having to do that work, I feel like Fat Liberation and like Haze and all of these things have been doing that work. And when things like this happen, it's kind of like a push back against us. And like, wow, we've done all this labor for all these years. And now this is happening. And now our bodies are still going to be targeted. Like you're still going to make this about fatness. You're still going to, make us out to be monsters and have this very huge fear mongering that they're doing. It's like a very interesting moment to hopefully turn the mirror on them and say like, is this really what you want to be pushing out during this global pandemic?
I know, seriously. It really does feel so frustrating when we've all been doing this work for so many years and, the Haze and fat liberation movements go back decades. And like people have been doing this work literally since like the 60s and 70s. And now to have, it's like another sort of cannonball in their cannon or something, like another thing in their arsenal that they can sort of lob against us and say like, look, fat people are at risk for COVID-19, so therefore they shouldn't be fat. It's like another argument that is very loaded and people have a lot of feelings about. And, I think the rhetoric around all of this is so heightened and people are feeling like justifiably COVID-19 and the pandemic is like a matter of life and death for many people. And so the fact that it is this like very high stakes situation makes people feel like, well, if there's any possibility that being fat is a problem, then fuck Haze, fuck fat liberation. I need to like shrink my body. I think that's what is unfortunately happening for some people who are kind of on the fence or like maybe just starting to come over to the Haze and fat liberation side. It's like the heightened rhetoric around this makes it feel like it's all out the window.
Right. And I just think like, how dare you, CDC, like put this on like controlling body size and shape during a super traumatic event already. And I think that about so many areas of this, like this is we're all responding to such a traumatic event. We're all responding in different ways, and trauma exists in our bodies in so many different ways. And the last thing we need to be doing is really like hardcore policing our food and hardcore policing our bodies while also holding on to all of this trauma. And then like encouraging that message to be flown around to the millions of people who are reading and looking for those CDC updates is just a way to re-traumatize, and really another way to make it a much more riskier process for people who are already having these responses. Like now you're putting more stress on them to deal with this global crisis.
Right. And we know that the stress of stigma can actually worsen people's immune systems, make their entire bodies more, every body system have more stress that it has to deal with, and putting their physical health and mental well-being at greater risk. So yeah, it's like not the moment to be doing that. It's not the moment to be sort of pushing people's buttons when they've already been traumatized by the fat phobia that exists in the medical system and in our culture at large.
Exactly that.
Oh my gosh. I could talk with you forever. This was such a great conversation. And I would love to let people know where they can find you online, learn more about your work, and follow everything you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been like an absolute pleasure. And I could definitely sit here and talk about this all day with you too. People can find me on Instagram. That's mostly where I live and hide out. And you can follow me at Fierce Fat Femme. And I'm also on Twitter, although I don't really know what to do with that, but still my name is Fierce Fat Femme on there as well. I'm working on creating a website, but that's not up just yet. So most of my things are all kind of just like harbored in on Instagram. That's my method of choice at this moment. So that's where you can all find me.
That's awesome. We'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can find you and follow you. And I love your Instagram, love what you're doing there. And just like your messages are so inspiring and hopeful and liberatory and important. So I think everyone should definitely give you a follow.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That makes my heart swell with like very happy feelings and warmth during this very interesting time in our world. Like this is the joy that I definitely need right now. So I really appreciate that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I love all your work and I can't wait to see how this all comes out.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Angelina Moles for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform, whatever that may be. And you can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. And you can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is another way to help new listeners discover us and is always so appreciated. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, just go to christyharrison.com/248. That's christyharrison.com/248. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, break free from diet culture, and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, and our transcriptionist, Mike Croft Holmes, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. And I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.